So where we want to pick up today is kind of where we left off yesterday. Yesterday we kind of started to implement this login form, and so I want to flesh out, maybe do a few remaining things there, mainly in terms of kind of working with the input fields and showing errors along with those inputs. And then the other side of things we want to do from there is then go look at how do we populate the list of pets. So that's kind of the next two pieces on the docket. So what I want you to do is get both of your projects running. You want the pet list, you want both the pet adoption, where we can do the back end, as well as the front end running. And then we'll get started on the next bit of coding. So I've got my backend running, npm run start. So you want to get both of your projects up and running. All right, why is am I still running something on the back end here? There it goes. Probably because you're calling nap on the object instead of using the underscore. Because that handles some of the errors. So, just one thing to check, just make sure everybody's here. Go ahead and try to log in with the correct credentials. You can get through, then great. If you have a problem, getting in, you type in the credentials and hit log in, and it doesn't work, please raise your hand so we can get that sorted before we get going. All right, so your backend's running. So let's see. URL. Eileen, are you up and running now? Okay. Good. Okay. So one of the things we kind of mentioned at one point yesterday and didn't get a chance to look at, there's kind of two things. So we mentioned that oftentimes we want to kind of indicate maybe under the field if there's an error with that field specific. So oftentimes we want to show errors on the individual fields instead of just at the bottom of the page, right? So that's one thing I want to look at. And then from there, the other thing we said, well, hey, I'm duplicating a lot of code for these different fields. Is there some way that we can make a component for that? So I'm going to put in the stuff for errors, and we're going to kind of extract all of that and move it to a new component. Cool. So that's the first two things I want to do here. So where I want to start is kind of going all the way up to the top of the login form. And what I would start by doing is saying, well, okay, I need some place to store an error message, right? And I need to store an error message kind of per field. I could put that in a state, but realistically, it's entirely driven off of the state that we already have, right? So what I might say is, okay, maybe I have a variable, we call it email error. We set that according to whatever our logic is, and then we also maybe have one for password error, right? Yep. I think I am. Am I not? Okay, I'll fix that. All right, stream should be live. So I need to say, hey, we want to show an error, right? What are the conditions for the email field being an error? What are the things, what are the requirements for that email field? What makes it valid or invalid?
Oh, you're asking it?
Yeah.
Has
to have an @ symbol, and it has to not be blank, right? So I might want to check for both of those things and give some sort of error message based on whether or not that's filled in or whether or not it has an @ sign, right? So I might say here, well, let's say if it's not there, right? Well, I can say email is required, something like that, right? Ternaries are a really helpful thing for this in terms of kind of simplifying the logic of writing out. So I can say, hey, here's the error, or otherwise it's just empty string, okay? Also might, as you mentioned, want to check that there's an @ sign there. How can I check that there's an @ sign in the email address? There's more than one way.
And JavaScript language, so
yep.
We can just use .contains on the field.
You're close, okay? There is a .contains in the C# world, but there is no method called .contains. There's a method that does the same functionality, that behaves the same way, it just has a different name. .includes, right? So over in C#, we call it contains with string.contains. Over in JavaScript, it's called string.includes. So here I can say, and this is kind of how I'm going to write this out. This will look a little bit interesting. Not email.includes at oh, yep, that should be a question mark, not a colon. Okay. This is kind of a weird way to write this. I'm using ternaries, and so part of the matter here is kind of understanding that, like, maybe you're more familiar with this statement still. And the shift kind of in the JavaScript world, and I think you're starting to see this, is I'm using a lot more ternaries than I do if statements, right? So this is kind of a trick, okay? You'll notice that I have 2 question marks in here. So what happens, and this actually works in any language that has ternaries. This is not a JavaScript specific thing. What I say is, if this is true, immediately evaluate to that, we're done. Otherwise, there's kind of some implicit parentheses here. And if I put them in, I'll kind of show you where they go, even though I don't usually include them. It would kind of look like this, right? So this whole second ternary is inside the right side of the first ternary. That's what's happening. So we say if there is an email, this is falsy, right? So if there is an email, we go over here and run this ternary instead. So it's kind of like running a sequence of if statements. I say if this, then do that, if this, then do that, and otherwise that last case is basically my else. So, and that's usually how I like to structure it. I wish that Prettier formatted it this way. Prettier does not. If you do the format, it's going to format it completely different. But this is how usually I would write that out for clarity. Okay? Does that kind of make sense for everybody? So it's just kind of like it's a series of nested if statements. So we're saying, or if else. So we say if it's not there, so we've got those different error messages, right? One of the reasons that I'm doing that as a ternary is that it allows me to do, is it kind of allows me to write this still as a const. If I actually had used if statements, then I would have needed a let there. And it also ends up kind of shortening the code as well. So for those 2 reasons, we're using that. Now let's look at the password. So password error. Again, we can start by saying, well, the password's required. So I can check for that first. But are there any other conditions on the password? Yeah, I think we did. So that's a good thing to go back and check, is you may want to go back and look at your back end and see what your joy schema was. So if I look back there, where do I have it? There's my login schema. So my login schema, I've said that this needs to be an email. So implicitly, that's going to kind of check that the @ sign is there. And yeah, there is a minimum length requirement of 8 on the back end. So I may want to check for that on the front end as well. So add that back in, kind of the way we did before. If password dot length is less than 8, so I can pretty quickly express those requirements. Yeah. Oh, yes. I don't know why I added that exclamation mark. But if it's less than 8, that's I don't know why I added that. There. So typically speaking, you're going to want some sort of condition like that. The reason I'm going ahead and putting it into a variable is it turns out there's a few different places where this can be useful to have it. And so if we just go ahead and put it in a variable, then we can reuse it in the 2 or 3 different places that we often find that we need it. Okay. Cool. Is everybody good with that? So that gives me a way to kind of express those. So now that we've got those strings, I want to put them into the UI. So I'm going to go back down to where we're rendering, and I'm going to say underneath the input, so here I'm on the email input first, I'm going to say if there is an email error, and div /div, and this is going to have a class of text danger because we want to indicate it in red. And inside of there, we're going to jump back into JavaScript land and include the email error. Right. So what this should accomplish is it should show that error that we built out if it exists underneath the field. Now, I do see one gotcha in the, it looks almost like it's appearing maybe too close to the field above. So I might want to add a little bit of margin in there. So maybe I just try MT1 to kind of space it out from the field above. So you can see it's kind of slick there. It automatically just goes ahead and changes as you're typing. Okay, so I've got that error for the email. I also want to include the similar code. I'm going to copy this, put it underneath the password, and just change it to password error. So that should get you dynamically showing an error message as it's going on.
Also seems to do as soon as you load in your page, so is that kind of behavior where you want to that or not?
That's a good question, right? So it immediately happens because immediately before unless you have autofill, which I do, right? So it's pretty good. So you know, how is that an issue, right? Could that be the friendliness problem? Maybe not, right? Depends on the thing. A lot of times we might hide them until we submit a form. We could do that. I'm not going to worry about doing that here. I'm just going to say, okay, those errors are clear. That's something you could enhance. So what we're kind of getting to is we want to have this. We're going to have this. We want to have this for most of our fields. This some sort of indication of what the status of that is. Now, one thing to notice, even though I'm including that error, notice that it still allows me to press the login button. I'm still allowed to press login even though the data is invalid, right? So I'm showing the user some information, but I'm not really blocking them from actually trying to submit the form, right? So that's another part that we kind of need to get in here, right? We need to probably prevent the user from logging in until they fix the data. Does that make sense? So what can we do from that front, right? How can we block the user from logging in? Yeah.
We can use the disable property.
Okay, so we could disable the button, right, is one possibility. The problem with disabling a button is it gives the user no indication of why it's disabled. is the user just says, hey, it's disabled. I don't know why it's disabled. So what else could we do? What else can I do rather than disable the button? Well, I can think about, what's triggering this code to be sent. If I look up, remember that we have this on-click submit event, right? I could say, well, maybe I only want to run and send this request if there's no errors. Does that make sense? I may want to say, let's not proceed with this if there's any errors with the fields. So I might say here, let's ditch that console log that we've kind of finished there. I might say if there is an email error or there is a password error, I really just want to tell the user that there's a problem and kind of get out of here. So I might say set error and say something to the effect of please fix errors above, and immediately return from that function. So if I do something like that, the rest of this function doesn't get a chance to execute. But the user still has a way of seeing, it's still giving the user some indication. They can still click the button. It just tells them see the errors above, right? So it still provides that communication that something's up and gives them a way to see how they can fix it rather than just disabling the button. You could additionally disable the button. Honestly, usually, even when you disable the button, I'll usually go ahead and do checks like this. Cool? Makes sense? So this is another place where you might want to include that error message, and that's part of why I put it into a variable. Questions so far? It's all kind of making sense? Okay. So now that we have that in place, right, so we've got error messages appearing beneath the fields, and I have the kind of error at the end that's blocking the send. What I want to do is extract some of this code and move it into a separate component. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to take the part that's kind of duplicated, which is that whole div here, right? So for each field, I've got this div, which contains a label, an input, and now also a place for an error message. And I want to break that out into a separate component, right? So what do we call that component? What do we want to call that component? Tossing out some ideas.
We should probably start some kind of structure, naming structure.
You said what?
We should probably have some kind of naming structure so that the parent component will itself.
What do you mean the parent component? Like, are you wanting to break these up into three or four different components?
I'm saying that this is the login form, and then this component is going to be used inside the login form, so that we should name it login form hyphen whatever we're going to component we call them.
So the problem with calling that is login form like input or whatever, is that means that I can only use it on the login form. So the way I want to extract this, I want to actually extract it in a way that I can use it with all of my forms. I don't want it to be specific to the login form specifically. I want to be able to use this in the login form, the register form, like your bug editor, your user editor. I want to be able to use this all over the place, right? Because the combination of input and label is pretty general, right? Pretty general. So other names. What we call it is not as important as extracting it. You said input?
Email input.
Email input.
I was thinking like input fields or like form input fields.
Yeah, I would go something that general, right? I would avoid one name in specific. I would try to avoid calling it input specifically because it's like, well, is it the input tag or my custom input field, my input control? So yeah, maybe input field is where I might land. Let's call this whole thing input. Form input field would be fine too. So I'm going to make a component we're going to call input field, and I'm going to extract that code for it. So new component, or sorry, new file. I'm going to go call this input field.js. I'm going to start with the kind of skeleton function input field. Export default input field. So we have an input field. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that block of code that we already have for the email input. So with the div, the label, the input, the error, and I'm going to say in here, let's return all of that. Do a quick format on it, and we'll clean it up. Okay, there's going to be a bunch of errors. That's okay. But what we're trying to figure out is okay, I've got this thing I keep repeating, right? I want to generalize it. And in the process of generalizing it, I need to figure out what are the parts that change from field to field to field. Okay? And one of the things that we'll see is I kind of mentioned I want this to be more general than just the login form, because there's nothing really in here, it turns out, that is specific to the login form. All of this can work with the register form. Okay? So the first things that maybe should draw your eye is kind of working from the top to bottom, right? So if we start at the top, what's the first thing that you see that needs to be generalized, that we need to turn into a property? What's the first thing that you see? HTML4, which actually maps up to what? Maps up to the ID. So it turns out like those have to be the same value, right? So actually I can pass those in as one thing. So if I say, let's do curly braces here, because we're going to accept some properties, curly braces ID, right? Well, then I can just say, okay, well, this right here is the ID property. Both the for, HTML4, and the ID down here, those both become ID. In fact, I'm immediately starting to see one of the benefits of this is I don't have to remember to keep those things in sync. This is going to help me keep those things in sync. Okay. Another thing that you'll see kind of up at the top, right, this text right here in the label, right, email, well, that's not always going to be email, right? That's going to change, right? So the label is conditional. Okay, I'm going to add another property for that. So label. So what I want to do is just kind of go down through these things and generalize them, right? I want to say, you know, what's the general sort of pull these things from properties. Okay. So that actually fixes the label, right? So label's all nice and general, it just needs an ID and a label. Next thing we kind of work through here, okay, well, all the inputs have form control. That's fine. All the, do all of them, are all of them going to be type email? Okay, so I need to make that a property too. So type, right? And what we want to do is kind of go through these one by one and extract them out. And so we'll find out, oh, autocomplete is something separate, etc., etc., etc. And we'll start kind of working through those. Okay. Now I'm going to pull all these out. I'm going to show you, once we get done, I will show you a bit of a shortcut for some of these things. So placeholder, this is value. So value goes here. I need an on change property, and I need an on change here. Okay. Now, what you're starting to see is hopefully that there's a lot of properties that we're starting to put up to the top. One gotcha is, what if there's some properties that I don't think about, right? What if there's some things I want to know that aren't listed? So let me add, I'm going to bring the other one up as error. So I have an input field now, input field component. Requires a lot of properties to set it up, but it's kind of generalized, right? From what we had before, this is now all the such configured. Okay, any questions so far? Does that kind of make sense? Now, what if tomorrow I come along and I want to set another field, right? Let's say I come along in some later form and I say, well, sometimes this field needs to be disabled, right? I don't want to have to repeatedly come back in here and add more properties, right? Because this could go on for almost forever, because we're constantly adding more attributes to the HTML language, right? Is everybody hearing me there? Okay. So there's a trick that you can use, and this is kind of borrowed from a JavaScript trick, is remember we used the rest operator and the spread operators to kind of combine things. So part of the purpose of the rest operator is to kind of say, hey, well, give me all the things that remain. So it turns out that there's a lot easier way to represent this. If I think about it this way, what are all the things, if I start to look through this list, I'm going to see that there's a bunch of things that just directly go to the input tag. Most of them directly go to the input tag. I don't need to do anything special with. So looking through these, type, autocomplete, placeholder, value, on change, all of those, right, just directly go down here. So everybody see that? So what I can do is I can shorten this down a bit, and I can just say, okay, let's just bring out the ones we need specifically to treat special. And then at the end, I'm going to say ... make a variable called the rest. Okay. So rest is now going to contain all of the rest of the properties that are passed, but that I haven't specifically called out. Does everybody see that? So there's a really cool thing you can do on the other side, is rather than spelling those all out down here, I can do ... rest, take all those properties that we just combined, spread them back out, and now all of those things will be there. So that means, like, if tomorrow I come in and I want to set disabled to true, or I want to set minimum to 5 or max to 1,000, or set the required attribute, any of these other fields, I can set them, I can pass them through without having to know that those attributes are there on the input to begin with. Make sense? Look cool? So this is basically has that same effect as what we had just written, but it passes those things along. Okay, so rest is a very, very useful technique. Now, there's one gotcha in here, one attribute that's going to cause a problem, namely that we are taking all the rest and we potentially have an overlap where I might be setting a property twice, which isn't really legal. So I've called out the ID, but I haven't called out class name. So if I were to set the class name property, this would actually on the input be setting class name twice. You see that? So I do need to treat the class name property special. So I might pull that up here and say class name. To say I want to treat that as something different. Now, in this case, I think the best thing to do is to just call it out and not do anything with it, because realistically, if I set class name, which thing should it apply to? Should it apply to the container, the label, the input, the error? It's kind of hard to say, right? The safest thing to do might be to put it to the outer div, but even that I don't necessarily know to say. So everybody good with that? So, you know, maybe the safest thing I could do there is to just kind of pull it out and ignore it for the moment. And maybe come back in later and add some additional properties. Like I might add a container class and an input class or things like that if I did want the user to specify some of those classes. So does this make sense? Does this make sense to everybody? So what we built for the input field? Really, overall, not that much. In fact, let me format. It's going to get a little bit shorter. But now I've captured all of that stuff. I think if I even pull this over here, let me just see if it does. Oh yeah, it does want to keep it that way. Okay, cool. So now I need to go back. I need to go back to the login form, and I need to use this new component that we've made. Okay, so I'm going to jump back over there. And I'm going to go up to the top, and so I'm going to import that. So import the input field. I'm going to go ahead and hit tab, and that should autofill that for me. You know, there are still things that, as it turns out, there are still things that we can't really avoid the duplication on. So for instance, you know, we still have this state variable that we need to match up with, and we still have some logic we need to do for figuring out the error. That's much harder to push into the component, but at least some of the HTML stuff we can push down. So I brought in the input field. I'm going to go back down, now that we've imported it, and I'm going to keep in place the email field for a second so I can kind of compare it. So input field, okay? So if we think through, what are the things that we need to pass down? So we went through and we said, okay, it needs to have label, ID, error, and then anything remains is going to go down to the input. Okay, so I know I need to set label is equal to the text that we have here. The ID of this field is going to be what I had before. Then what else did I need? I needed type email, these ones, value on change, bring all those up. And finally, I need to set the error to email error. So this tag is now equivalent to kind of what we had before. And I'm going to do the same thing for the password field. Ditch this. And so input field, let's see, I have label is password, the ID is login form desk password, the type and such I can bring in from down here, and then the error is going to be the password error value. So there's a limit to how much shorter that this can get, just simply from the reason that we have a bunch of things that we have to configure still per field. And so we kind of can't get around that a little bit. But I can drastically reduce some of the more common errors and reduce some of the repetition that we were having previously. So I'm only configuring the things that have to be configured. Cool? Questions? Does that make sense? Kind of pulling things out into more general field. And, you know, if you think about, like, we only saved a little bit here, but when I go to a nice bigger sort of edit form where I might have maybe 10 fields, that adds up, right? It also means because I'm kind of building in things like in the input field, I'm linking the label and the input together, I don't have to remember to do that every time. I don't have to remember to set HTML4 because HTML4 is being set for me. So you can avoid a lot of common errors if you start extracting duplicate kind of line data entry errors. So once you have that, test it, make sure it works. It should work the same way that you had it previously. Are you trying to initialize it with something? So Control-C, Control-Z to go back. What you want to do instead is restrict it, because that's it.
I was just wondering what this is for.
This, you've got yes, so that's linking it. So showing the value. So what we do, let's say
I'm just wondering why we're doing like a value or something we're testing.
So we have to link it to the value vector. The password variable, password state has to be linked to the invoice point. That's what we do. So we're linking it out. We want to link that variable to the yeah, that's the problem with that automatic adding the same point. It's actually not really on that there, so that return has to be otherwise that's part of the process. So you're either your backend server's not running, or you're the problem with the web. So go look at the login form and install that. And also that and that URL. So whatever URL that's coming in is probably not the right one. So yeah, so that's saying it's not picking up this URL. So let's try here. What I would find, let's do it in just make it and also track the environment. That's so simple group. And that's good. And oftentimes it will pick it up to make sure that it's the same with the environment. There. Yeah, just have. And you can that's up in place. Bring it back into so roll out so you got the login. So you just made this input field, you import it at the top, and then we're going to replace the stuff that we found. And you get all that one. So, not that fault. So, console. Okay, so there's a bunch of errors here. So you put that in the market, which is saying, let me check if you are in this working. Exactly. So, what you want to do is, to environment is actually sources and services. So you stop the server and you start it. Because this point is going to be yes. Have you done it? Yeah. I'm going to take a look. There you can log in. That's that's not right. So what you want to do is open up your console in the browser and take a look at what's going on with the browser. So something's not. So it says nothing was returned, right? So in your input field, first of all, you've got a typo, because you misspelled input field. It's possible you, so name the file and the function and all of that. Okay. So hang on, open up the input field. But you're missing, okay, so you have a return that you're going to put format. So let's try it. So, so we're going to want to import. And we're clicking the apply elements. Some things are right. So what I want you to do is go down to here. I'm not sure what's happening at this point because it should be showing something. I check the network tab and see if there's anything. So it's not even saying request. So it looks almost like it's always getting in here. Because you have a single space. Yeah, that's right. Because that's then tricking and saying that there's always. Not all good. If you commented out the other code to be replaced, just go ahead and get rid of that comment out. What was the question?
Which one else? Yeah, but just go in. Maybe type it right. Yeah, I still don't get what this is doing. You have to explain it to me the reason why this matters because I'm not seeing it.
If you don't, so leave it out. Comment it out.
I tried to comment it out. I'm not seeing any function.
So that, which actually, if you take it out.
Oh,
There's a comment. So if you take it out completely, what you want to do is refresh now. Start typing in. So no matter what you, oh, okay. That's a good question. So when you refresh, you see how initially it doesn't have that value? So like what's happening is the value is not linked up with the value that there is. So go back up to your thing at the top. Right? So you initialize this to high, go back to blank. One of the things you'll notice is that this is a different error message. Right? So the error message is based on this variable. It's not based on what's in that field. And so if you don't link up the value, then you're not linking those things together. So it's just something you have to remember. Otherwise, what's in the field is not what's in the field. What's in the back end is not what's in the field. It's to keep those two things. Okay. What's happening right now is as soon as you trigger the on change event, it's getting the six back to sync. So it doesn't seem like there's problems after the first function. Yep. So it says nothing in front of the vendor. Go again if you want. You can't return there, so nothing is going to send it. Mentions the on that side. Yeah, you just complete the property, otherwise it's, no, we'll go to this thing. Otherwise it just automatically sends it. Okay. Okay. So that's going to help ease us as far as if we want to make additional changes. That also, like you asked the question of, you know, hey, the errors are appearing initially, right? If you wanted to go fix that, which I'm not going to fix that here, that then enables you to just do those fixes on that one component potentially, rather than maybe you can lower the amount of changes you might have to make. Okay, because you can build more of that in there. The other side of things I want to do, remember at some point that we had styled things where there's an is valid or is invalid class that you can add to those form inputs to give them either green or red, depending on if the value there is successful. I want to integrate that into this input field as well, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of towards the top, I'm going to add a variable, and I'm going to call this input classes. Okay, so this is kind of store the values, what we want that to be for the form input. So we know that it always needs to have the class form control. And we want to conditionally give it either is valid or is invalid. So what I would build in here, maybe space at the end of that, plus, and then we can say, well, let's put a ternary in there and say if there is an error, then I'm going to add the is invalid, and if there's not an error, we're going to say is dash valid. Okay. Once I've declared that, I'm just going to bring it in here on line 10. So on line 10, I'm going to say now those classes are dynamic. Okay. So just building that into this one component should make it and I don't think you can see the icons for the simple reason that I think my plugin is kind of showing up on top of it. So new incognito window. Yeah, there we go. So that helps give us kind of that styling to the field. So there's a lot of things like this that you can do once you start getting it to be generalized. You can start adding functionality that you want everywhere on all of your fields. Let me pull that up. I feel like I'm missing something. Source, components, input field. Form is valid, is invalid. Yes, I have that. Cool. So quick things we can do there just to give the user some indication of what's going on. Okay. So our next task at hand, once we've got that in place, is we want to now go back and think about the next screen. So the next screen where the user goes to when they log in is going to be to go to the pet list, right? So if I try to log in here, it's going to take me over here. And so I want to populate this now with some data. Okay. So the place I usually start when I'm trying to get a list and a list to work is there's a few different tasks that we need to accomplish. So one of the things we need to do is to go get the data from the API. From API. Show it in the list. And render each item. So these are three things that we have to do in order to get our system up and running, right? So I find more often than not, it's helpful to kind of do these backwards, is to actually figure out how the item is going to be rendered first, and then work up and figure out how to render the list, and then finally go back and make the API call. I usually find it's much easier to do it backwards. Is everybody good with that? So that's how I'm going to work through this. Okay, is I'm going to look at how do we render the item first. So I'm going to add another component. I'm going to call that the pet list item. .js function pet list item. Export default pet list item. Okay. Now I do need some properties because I need some data to populate this with. So, what I want really is a pet. I'm going to call this item to kind of try and keep the code generic. Because if I call it pet, then this is maybe code that I can't reuse as much. But if I start by saying, well, this is the item that I want to display, then it makes it easier to reuse the kind of techniques and whatnot. Okay, so we're going to say, hey, it takes an item as a property. We're going to get that whole object that's going to end up coming from the API, but I'm going to kind of slowly work my way towards that. Okay, so I'm going to start with a hard-coded item, and then I'll work my way towards the API request. Okay, so we need this to display a single pet. Okay, what's the information that we need to show? What's the information that we're getting in? How can I find that out? Yep. So I would go to the back end, take a look, and remember yesterday I gave you some sample data to work with. So if I look at the sample data, I can see what's in there. So every pet has an underscore ID property, which is the ID of the pet. There's a name, there's a species, there's a gender, there's an age. There may also be some other auditing information, right? So let's focus on the first parts, right? The name, the species, the age, the gender. So I need to show that somehow to the user, right? Those are the pieces of information that I want to show to the user, okay? So the easiest place to start is say, hey, I'm going to throw a div in here and just start by displaying all those bits of data. So I might say item.name. Huh? Yeah. Oh, yes, there should be a return. So we've got the name, the species, the gender, and age. Okay, so I'm going to start with that as kind of a basic starting point. Obviously, I want to beef this up and make it a little bit more user-friendly, but I can start with that here. What I'm going to do is then go up to the pet list, and I want to render one of these pet list items. Okay, so that's my pet item. I'm going to pull up my pet list, and I'll stick these side by side for anybody that's still coding both of these. So what I want to do, import pet list item, tab, and in here I want to define a pet, const pet, and I'm just going to hard code in some data for that pet. So maybe I say underscore ID 1, the name of that name is maybe Fido, and where did I have this? Oh, that's another thing I kind of skipped over. Okay, so species, and so this is maybe dog, gender, so I'm specifically not putting it in as male or female. I'm going to write it as a single letter because one of the things I want to show is what do we do if like the data that's in the database is not exactly how you want to show it on the front end. So age is 5. Okay. So I've got a quick pet. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to then say let's render a pet list item, and we're going to say item is equal to that pet. Okay. So this way when I'm looking at that pet list, I should see just this single item, which I do. Okay. So that's where we're starting at, right? I've got the data on screen, but it's maybe not in a very user-friendly fashion. But the reason I start here is because it's very easy to get up and running and start to see the results of like how you want to lay it out. And what I usually find is these kind of things, the decisions you make down rendering the item, start to kind of bubble up as you work on the other processes. Okay. So, what can I do to make this look better? Right? What can I do to improve the layout of this item? So oftentimes when we're representing things, and remember we've got Bootstrap handy, oftentimes we think about things on the front end as cards. So a card represents a single item, right? So I might say, hey, I want to display a list of pets or whatever it may be. I'm generally going to say that is a card. It used to be that the kind of normal way of representing things like this in a list was use tables, but tables turn out to be not very mobile friendly at all. So we want to switch over to using a card. Okay. So if you look at the Bootstrap documentation, you'll find that there's a few classes you need to add. So first, on the outer level, we need to add the class name card. Okay. Now, if I simply add that, you're going to already see that it starts looking like a box. I'll bring this over. So I already get some of the some of the look just by switching it over to a card. Okay. Now, notice that the card flipped over to white, right? Notice the card flipped over to white, or a light gray. You see that? And notice I can't actually see the text. Okay. So the reason that the problem is here is because of something I had done earlier. So if I go back up to the application, and let me just show you this here. So on this outer div, I've given this BG black and BG and text white. Okay, which I said that all of the text here is white, which flipped all that. So it turns out the Bootstrap's kind of making an assumption that a baked-in assumption that your text is black and your background is white, right? So like the default theme makes that assumption. So oftentimes if we want to go for, say, a dark theme, we actually tend to usually need to get into the Sass and play around with it there. Okay? Does everybody see that? So I'm going to actually take out those two classes that I added previously just as a quick way to fix that problem. Okay? I could go further with this, and I could try to kind of override some of those things, but it's going to end up meaning that I have more and more problems like this that crop up. Okay? So go back up to the application. On this outer div, remove those two classes, BG dark and text white. That'll get us back to a point where we can see the page. Okay. Now, so card does one thing. It's the starting point, and it also gives us that border. Yes?
Can you just add a text dark class to the card?
I could potentially to flip it back over, but that may not be the only time where those things occur, right? So that's part of where I want to back up and just say I'm going to leave that alone. Because the other thing that happened is I was having some issues with I think that check mark wasn't really even visible. I had that issue as well. So if you switch it that way, it tends to cause a lot of issues in a lot of different places. And I think part of that is, I think if you do text white, it puts implicitly an important and says that it's important that it's white. So those kind of things, if you want to change the website as a whole, we tend to need to do those in kind of CSS, if that makes sense. That's kind of the long story short, is that stuff we need to do by messing with the CSS and more usually messing with some of the Sass variables. Okay. So I'm gonna go back to this. Back to a light thing.
Do you want to leave formatting only in the class names that the Bootstrap on the JS file, and you want to add on the CSS?
So if I need to, what I'm saying is if I want to switch over to a dark theme, then more of that is going to need to happen in the CSS files, if that makes sense. Like I'm going to have to take a different approach than just adding those two classes, is what I'm saying. Okay? Maybe we'll work back and get back into the dark theme later, but for now I'm just going to back that up. Okay? So we're back at a light theme. Okay. So card gives us that outer level. If you can see it, and probably can see it on the screen, it doesn't show up well on the projector. You might notice that the text is all the way next to that border. Okay, does everybody see that? So the reason that is because card is really all that's doing is just adding the border. To add the padding, you need another div in here. And so that div is what kind of sections out the card. So cards implicitly, cards in kind of the Bootstrap definition, have 3 sections. So all the cards have a header, a body, and a footer. You can choose to not include all these three parts, right? But your card should always have a body, okay? Always have a body. They can have a footer, they can have a header, they don't have to. A lot of times I don't include the header, and sometimes I may just include a footer and no header. So what I want to do is wrap all of this in another div. Okay, that is going to be the card body. Div, class name, card body. And the card body comes with some built-in padding, which is going to push that in. Now, one thing I want to play around with briefly is that the outline of the card, the border of the card by default is this kind of very light color, which is really hard to see, especially maybe if you're looking up here. So I'm going to go ahead and change the border color to dark. I believe I can just do border dark on the card, and that should switch it over so that you can see it. Cool? Okay, another thing I want to do is, so I've got the card and I've got the card body. Those are the two parts that you always have to have. So every card needs to have a card and a card body, and those do have to be separate divs, just so we're clear. You can't put card and card body on the same div. In here, most of the times we want our cards to kind of have some sort of like header or title that kind of gives the main heading of the card, right? So of the pieces of information that we have, the name, the species, the gender, the age, what would make the most sense for the title? Probably the name of the pet, right? So what I want to do is I'm going to give that class is card dash title. I need to do class name. Okay. That delineates that this is the title portion of the card, which actually the title, as you can see, can appear either in the body or it can appear in the header. Both of those are legal. If you look through the examples, you'll find both, but I think their first example just shows it being in the header, but it doesn't have to be in the header. Out of the box, the title really doesn't have a lot of styling on it. All it really did was just kind of pushed the next things down. It's really just a little bit of margin. So oftentimes one of the things we need to do with the title is increase the size of it a bit. Okay. Some of the examples show that doing that using a header tag, an H1 or an H2, an H4, etc. But remember that we need to use those headers to kind of delineate the outline of the page, right? And so there's a few problems with that, right? So semantically, right, if I am going to apply a header, what header should I apply? What header level would this be? Well, it has to be something specific. It has to be H2. Why? It can't be H3 because you'd be skipping the H2, right? So if we look at what, like this is the header of the page in the pet list, right? This is an H1. Your page can only have one H1. Then inherently means if this is a header, it has to be H2. Okay. So maybe I say I include that, right? So maybe in here we give this, or actually maybe I'll make that an H2 instead of div. Okay. So we say that's an H2. Okay, so semantically it has to be an H2. What if I want to use this on a different page where an H2 doesn't make sense anymore. Like, what if I'm using it on another page where it's not the H2? Maybe it's further down in the list, right? That oftentimes happens, where I may want to use this in some context, and maybe on this page it needs to be an H4 semantically, or on this page it needs to be an H2. So sometimes I'll handle that by just literally making it a div and not worry about it. But that's sometimes you may have to consider those kind of things. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it, at least for now. I'm going to leave it as an H2 because I think I'm only going to end up using this on this one page. That's fine. The issue there is I may or may not be happy with the size of the H2, right? H2 comes with a certain size and comes with certain styling, right? I may want it to be bigger or smaller than that. Is everybody understanding me with that? So semantically, it has to be an H2 from accessibility standpoint. But what I can do is Bootstrap's got some classes built in, such as like FS4, short for font size 4. That behaves, if you give it an SS4, it looks like an H4. Or if I give it an FS1, it will look like an H1. So I can use that font size class to give it the size that looks good visually, but give it the header, the tag that makes sense semantically. So that's where we're kind of, we have to distinguish between like, how do we want it to look versus how does it need to be semantics and structure versus the styling. Okay, everybody good with that? So that's the thing that comes up, and Bootstrap doesn't do a really good job of explaining that, but that's a really important thing in terms of accessibility. It's one of those big pain points. Another class that they recommend adding is this class card text, and we actually do want to add the class card text to all of the divs below. Okay. Basically, the reason, you'll see very little effect right now with that card text class. The reason it exists is it makes it easier when you need to go back and maybe change the card to a different color. That gives you a good way to target all of the text on the card and change it to a different color. So let's say I wanted to make this card maybe a black card, a darker colored card. Then I can flip all the card text to white. So are we good with that? So that's why that class exists, is so you can switch the colors later. You can theme it later. Okay. Other things we might want to do. Okay. Can I maybe represent this in a more compact way?
Horizontally.
Yeah, maybe horizontally, right? Like dog and male and 5, maybe I can represent that all in one line. So maybe what I want to do is kind of move those all into one div and make these just be spans. So I might go, rather than what we have here, maybe I do a single div. This has got class of card text. And then inside of there, I just have 3 spans. Span, item species, gender, and age. And the reason I'm doing these div and span tags this way is for, first of all, semantics, but it also helps with backwards compatibility a bit to have the right starting tags. Okay? Now, is there a problem that immediately occurred now that I made this change? Spacing, right? They're all like right next to each other, right? So with React, it oftentimes will strip out spaces that are there, like normally in HTML, there would be spaces between these spans, but React is actually stripping out all of those spaces between them. So I need to include them. So one way you can get them in, and this is sometimes happens as you're reformatting stuff, is one way you can add them in is to do something like this. And that would add a literal space between those two spans. Does everybody see that? So that's one way you can do that. If you need to introduce hard spacing, you might want to do that. The other thing I can do is just use margins. Yes. Okay. I don't know. It's weird. So what I'm going to do, which usually works better with Prettier, because Prettier doesn't get rid of these, is I might do something like an MX2. Okay, an MX is margin on the left and right side, margin along the x-axis, and that's going to give it some more spacing out. So I might do MX2. Let's see what happens if I do MX2 on all three of those. Okay. So that starts to space out maybe a little bit better. If you wanted to fine tune it, make it smaller, you could do that. I might also notice that maybe I don't want the margin on the left here, right? Maybe I don't want double margins there. So the other thing you could do is ME for margin end. One gotcha for people that are familiar with Bootstrap 4. In Bootstrap 4, there was an MR and an ML for left and right. In Bootstrap 5, they've renamed those. So it used to be MR, ML, and R. In 4, it's now M, S, and M, E. Margin start and margin end in Bootstrap 5. So a lot of places in Bootstrap where it used to be L and E, it's S and, or L and R, it's S and E now. The reason that they've made that shift is they're trying to support languages that are not English, that are not left to right. So there are some languages that are right to left, so start and end actually flip. So sometimes start will be on the left and sometimes start will be on the right, depending on the direction of your language. Does that make sense for everybody? So that's why the new names. And unfortunately, ML and MR don't do anything anymore because they've taken those out completely. So you have to do as an S. Okay. So we've got some spacing there. Other things I might want to say is I kind of need to know what that unit is, right? That 5 doesn't tell me so much. What unit is that and what does that represent? Is that 5 days? Is that 5 months? Is that 5 years? We need to pick a unit. So what unit are we going to pick? Maybe years? 5 years old? So I'm going to say hard code in some text here. So oftentimes I find myself needing to give some just descriptive text, and you can just remember that I can put those things in directly. Other things I want to do is I want to say if the gender is M, then I want to display that as male. If it's F, I want to show that as female. Okay. So going back to my tools, ternary is kind of my tool of choice. So what I might say in here, I'd say item.gender is equal to male is equal to M. Then we're going to show it as male if the item.gender is F, then we're going to show it as female. And if it's anything else, I'm just going to show the value from the database. So this kind of that same technique that we use to show the error messages on the login form to come up with this. Well, we're kind of using nested terminates. You could also write that out and make that as a function call or such if you wanted to write it out that way. Cool. Okay. What else can I do? How else can I make this look a little bit better?
Labels or some pills or something?
Some what?
Labels or some pills?
Labels or some pills?
Yep.
So what do you mean by labels?
So we can describe the fields that we're explaining.
Okay. So I would argue that labels aren't really necessary here, per se, because I kind of know from the way it's displaying, I know what those represent. I don't think we necessarily need any descriptive text. But yeah, pills might be a good thing. So like in Bootstrap, there is something called a badge. And we can represent these, maybe these pieces of information as maybe badges, right? So I might add the class badge. I'm just going to add it first to the first one. Okay. Notice that immediately it goes to white. Okay, so anytime we're using badges, we have to remember to also include a color with them. So it used to be in Bootstrap 4 that was like badge primary. With Bootstrap 5, it's now, they've gotten rid of those things, and it's just the BG classes, the background classes. So I might say something like BG primary, and that will bring it back in and look like this. So that's a very common trick that we use to just kind of display kind of quick bits of information all in a short kind of space. So I might say badge primary for all of these. And that's going to make that look a little bit better. Another thing we commonly do is you might change the color of that badge based on different things. So I could say like dogs are a certain color, and cats are a different color, and mice are a different color. You know, I might change it based on the species. I might change it based on how many years old it is. So maybe a 1-year-old pet shows up in a certain color, or 5-year-old pet, 10-year-old pet shows up in a different color. So I could also color code it to quickly be able to see, you know, what's going on there. Cool. So those are things we use pretty often when we're displaying data, is using cards and using badges to display different pieces. Everybody good with that so far? Kind of making sense? What we're working with? So, you know, I usually start from this side and kind of work my way back, right? So I start with how am I going to render the item, and then work back to how I render the list. Okay? So let's take that, and I'm going to go back to the code for the list. Okay, so for the list, I want this to now be an array of pets. So I'm going to need to have 2 pets here. So pets is now an array. So square brackets for array, curly braces for object. And so I have 1 and 2, Fluffy the cat, okay, and so I might say, okay, just to test this before I get too much further, I might say, hey, this is pets 0, and this one is pets 1. One thing I'll notice here is that it almost seems like the cards are appearing right next to each other, right? Everybody see that? So one of the things to remember usually when I'm adding in cards is I want to add a little bit of bottom margin to each card. So in this case, I'm going to add MB2 to just space them out a little bit. I'm going to add MB2 up to the top layer in there. Okay. Yeah. Do you remember from the shopping cart example, do you remember what I used to render a list of things, right? So I can hard code it as this, but what did I use to render a list? Do you remember what that was? It's underscore.math, right? And so underscore comes from what package? Comes from Lodash. Okay. So I need to import at the top. Maybe I'll do it before the components. I kind of try to keep my components and my other imports separate. So import underscore from Lodash. So I'm going to add that import up at the top. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, we're in pet list. Because an item just represents a single item. So I'm over on the pet list. I'll bring this back up. So I got my pet list item over there, and I've got my pet list. So what I want to do is I want to take the array and I want to map it. So curly braces underscore dot map, and I'm going to map the array of pets to items. So item, and I'm going to map this to pet list item. Okay. Item is equal to item. Other things I got to remember to do is anytime I'm using this map, or rendering an array of any sort, I have to remember to give this a key. So the key here would be item dot underscore ID. I saw a few people when they were kind of working through this previously using ID. Do remember that when we get back to Mongo, that this is going to need to be underscore ID. So a few places where you may have put that into your project, you're going to have to switch some of those things over. So I usually try to go ahead and make the underscore ID to begin with. So we're typically going to see this pattern anytime we want to render a list of things. We're going to use map to render a list of things. What's up, Evan? Okay. So that's our starting point. Another thing I commonly go ahead and do at this point is I say, well, what do I want it to render if nothing's there, right? So just from a demonstration purposes, I'll collapse that down and comment this out. And so I'm going to say temporarily, let's just say const pets is equal to just an empty array. So if pets is just an empty array, how does this look? not the greatest, right? Your user has maybe no knowledge or no way of knowing that there should be anything on this page. Do you see that? So oftentimes I need to show the user a message when there's nothing there, right? When there's nothing to see. So what I use for that is I'm going to add another pair of curly braces here and use another method from Lodash, namely isEmpty. And then I'm going to check if the pet list is empty. This actually does a few things. It checks if pets is undefined. It checks if it's null. It checks if it's an empty array. And all of those cases will trigger this being true. And then I can say, okay, well, let's conditionally render some other element, some sort of other message. So no items found. Something of that sort. So that way the user has kind of a meaningful message when there's nothing there. Cool. That's a kind of common usability trick, is to show the user a message like that when there's nothing in the list. Questions? Is that all making sense? So, you know, the way we've got this hooked up, right? This is how I work through this. You know, I start with the item first. I figure out how I'm going to display. I walk back up and just try to play around with some static data. And then once I've got it kind of good on that front, I kind of have the layout the way I want it. That's where I start bringing in the network requests, right? So now that we have those things in place, I can start asking the database, I can start asking our backend for that data. Okay? So I'm going to ditch all of this. Okay? And I need to bring in some more imports. So one import I need to bring in, I need to bring in the useState hook. Actually, I need to bring in both the useEffect and the useState hook, because I'm going to use both of those in a second here. useEffect, useState, useState from React. And I also need to import Axios. So we're going to update our imports to have those three up at the top. So useEffect, useState, Axios, and underscore. Now, I have hard-coded this in. It's just kind of static data right now. One of the things that's going to happen when we're dealing with data coming from the network is that initially we won't have any data, and then later it will be loaded. So the fact that it changes inherently means that you need state to store the items. Does that make sense for everybody? So inherently I need to have state. So in here, I'm going to say const. I'm going to say, hey, we've got the items, comma, set items. And I'm going to say use state. And so initially, I don't have an array. Initially, I don't have anything. So I'm going to actually start that as null. Say, hey, we don't initially have any data whatsoever. Now, I changed my name here a little bit. I changed the name of that array to items. So I do need to update the code down here to be items instead of pets. Again, I'm trying to use those generic names to kind of make this more reusable. Everybody good with that so far, right? So initially, I'm going to start out with there's no data there. Okay. So when the page loads, I won't have time. I won't have time to go request those things yet, right? I don't have a way, in fact, with React to block the render pipeline and say, okay, you can't render until this is done. Okay. If the render is happening, the render has to go through, right? So remember we talked about asynchronous code a while ago, right? So this is a case of where I have to take advantage of that and I have to make things be asynchronous, okay? So let's say I do this. Let's say I call into Axios. So I want to make a request, and we'll kind of remember from yesterday, if I go back and look at what we had, remember I had to pull from that environment variable as my base. Pull this up. There it is. And that was this. Starts with process env React app API URL. So that's our baseline of where the API is located. From there, I need to tell it which endpoint I'm looking at. So that'd be API pet list is the backend endpoint that I want to retrieve, right? So I want to go to the server, retrieve the pet list, and come back and show that to the user. Also remember that we typically pass a second parameter of options, like things we want to pass in addition to that. So I might pass a method of get, okay, which it is by default, but I'm going to go ahead and put that in because there's some additional things, additional options we're going to need to specify here in a minute. Okay. So what I want to say is we need to do one thing if this comes back successfully. If we get back a response, and otherwise I need a catch. So we make a request, and I'm going to either console.log res.data, so we can take a look at the data if it comes back successfully, or I'm going to do console.error and log the error. It's going to kind of look like that. Back to what I had here a second ago. So that way we can start just looking at the log and seeing what comes back and seeing if we're getting what we'd expect. So if it's successful, we should get back an array of pets. If it's unsuccessful, we should get an error and we can diagnose that error. Okay, so take a look at my screen. I am going to log out. I'm going to refresh this page and go over to the pet list. And it looks like I am actually getting some data back, right? So Axios sent off the request, and it actually pulled back my two pets. Awesome, right? So that's good. One thing you might check real quick. Notice if I try to use a different path, maybe I try to do list 2, that's not a valid path, so I would get a different error. So it's going to come back here with like a 4. Right? So we're seeing that, hey, some things could go wrong. It might be that the server's not running. There could be cases where maybe I have to log URL, different things like that might cause an error, and those are some things we have to deal with. But let me just start by dealing with the success case first in this side. So if it pulls it back successfully, I've got an array. Okay, what do I want to do with that array? Probably call set items, right? So this just pulled back res data is now our array. I can say, okay, let's save that. Let's save that into our items variable. So set items res dot data. Okay. So we've got the bare simplest approach, but you can see, hey, we've got some data, right? And so now we've got not just data that's hard-coded here, we've got data that's coming from the internet. It actually turns out to be that kind of that easy, right? There's some more stuff we have to do in terms of handling errors and handling special cases to make sure that our code always works, or at least gives the user feedback when it doesn't. But that right there is kind of our starting point. Now, if you hit refresh, you might kind of see, like on mine, do you see how it keeps going through, making a bunch of requests? So the problem with the code that I've written here is it's actually generating an infinite loop, okay? So anytime I render this component, it triggers a request. When the request comes back, it's called set items to replace the items. That triggers another render. It goes, makes another request, sets that, causes another render. So this right now is continuously looping, and it's making a request every time that it needs to render. And specifically, anytime I call set items, it causes it to make the request again. So everybody see that? So that's a problem, right? I don't want it to do that. I don't want it to be repeatedly making requests anytime there's a little render, okay? So I want to limit how often that it does that render. Is everybody on board? Everybody see the same thing? Okay. So there's a trick we can use with React, and I've kind of brought it in already. There's this hook called useEffect, okay? So useEffect says, hey, there's these side effects and different things that I want to do. Namely, I want to do them either when, as we would say, in two events, in two cases, when the component is either mounted or updated, okay? What the component being mounted is that time when it initially appears on screen. That's when the component is mounted. And then if your properties change, then the component is being updated, okay? So if either of those two things, or sorry, need to be replaced, I forget what the updated case exactly is, but it's yeah, I think it's that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap all this code in a useEffect hook, okay? So just for demonstration purposes, and comment this out a second, I'm going to say useEffect, okay? useEffect requires us to pass a function, okay? And we're going to typically write this as an arrow function. The left side takes no parameters, and the right side is where we're going to run our code. So console.log, and I'm going to say effect. So we can see when this runs. So when I run, okay, so initially when I refresh the page, it doesn't run because right now I'm on the login component, login page. If I switch over to the pet list, you're going to see that it just logged effect. Everybody see that? So it logged when I went there. If I leave the page and come back, logs effect again, right? Because it's being remounted or updated. Okay. So that's kind of our trigger. Okay. So let's say I just do something as a test. So set items I'm going to replace this code in a minute, so you don't need to follow along with this. I'm going to say name. So this is an array with a single item in it. Name test. Okay. So if as soon as I come over to the pet list, there it's appeared. Okay. Now, still the same problem. See the counter continuously going up. The set items is still triggering a rewrite. Okay. So one of the things that I have to do is I still have to tell it, I don't want this to happen all the time, right? I don't want this to happen continuously. Okay. So use effect is kind of a way to do things like side effects. Some of the examples that they give is anytime you want to do focus or other APIs. Let's say you need to use something that needs to directly manipulate the DOM or jQuery. Will oftentimes use some of those things in a use effect hook. Okay. So it's a good way to kind of inject and get out of the React world as part of it. What we can do to solve this little problem here is you can pass a second parameter to use effect, and that second parameter tells us what are the conditions for, like, what data determines that this should be rerun. And so if I pass in just a pair of square brackets, what this ends up telling it is to only run the effect once. Okay, so it says only run this once, because I really only need to go grab the pet list once, at least as we stand here. So everybody good with that? That makes sense? So that second square brackets is going to tell us to just run it once when it's mounted and never again. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to take our code that we wrote for Axios and I want to move that into this use effect hook. That's going to get rid of the side where it continuously is replacing and requesting data. It's only going to do it once rather than repeatedly.
Cool. The reason why that didn't happen on the login form is because that line of code in Axios from the login form was only within a separate function, right?
It was triggered from an event. It was triggered from the user clicking the submit button, clicking the login button, right? So it didn't happen immediately on page load. Versus this is something I need to happen when this page loads. When the pet list is loaded, I need to immediately make a network request, right? And so that's why this comes up. That makes sense? So you're going to have places like this, including like the pet editor. You may want to go immediately get the pet item and put that in there to start with, right? So oftentimes you'll have data you need to do a fetch immediately when the page loads, and then use the data from there. Cool? Yeah. This doesn't preclude me from maybe having a button to trigger it later. So like I might have a refresh button to refresh this. But this ensures that it happens once. Cool? Okay. So those are some things you have to understand if you need to do lists is you do have to understand and work with this use effect hook, and you'll need that in a few different places. Okay. So now let's talk about error handling, right? Is everybody good and kind of understand what's happening here in the happy case? Happy path? Okay. So what happens when things go wrong? Okay. So one of the things that can go wrong, right, is I might have a URL that for whatever reason isn't valid, right? And refresh and go back here, right? So in this case right now, I'm logging out the error, but the user has no way to see that something went wrong, right? So I need to tell the user what happened, right? So how can I do that? Well, we talked about yesterday, right? Remember I put in kind of an error message that I showed the submit button, right? So I said, when we go to submit, I'm going to go look at that error and show it. So I would take a similar approach here and say, hey, let's show the error when it occurs. So I might say const error. Maybe we have an error status here. We'll say set error use state. So we have that initially blank. And so if something goes wrong, I'm going to set that. I'm going to call set error. So if something goes wrong here, we're going to call set error and set that to error dot message. Okay. Now that's our starting point. But remember, we have to display that, right? So this is saving it, right? If something goes wrong, I'll save that error, but also need to go back in and display it on the UI. So I might go back down to where we're rendering, and I might say, well, let's say if there's an error and then I want to show a div /div that's going to contain our error, and I'm going to give this a class name of text danger. So any component where you're making network requests can always fail. If you're making a request for the API, those can fail. You need to report those. Okay? And so here I'm reporting it at the top of the list. Now, it's kind of weird to be saying no items found and that error as well. So maybe I don't want to show both of those things, right? Maybe I want to say that this second message doesn't appear if there's already an error, right? So I might modify the code a little bit, like so. I might say if not error and empty, that's when it shows. So that way we don't initially start with this case of two different kind of error messages appearing to the issue. Yep.
I noticed when I had my screen populated with the data and then to change the URL, saved it and of course it, but it kept the data there and showed the error message. Yeah. That's a good question.
That's a good question. So we switch this here, and I can see if we can do that. Something like this, right? So remember one of the problems that we had yesterday is we had this problem of sometimes both the message and the error were appearing. Do you remember that? Like sometimes the message and the error were appearing. Because I'm never resetting the error. I'm actually never setting the error back to blank. I'm never fixing it, right? If we get a successful request, successful response, that doesn't set it back. Similarly, if I get a failed request, we're not removing the items from view. Okay. Now, the second part of removing the items from view is usually something we just kind of want to leave alone and say, okay, we failed to get it, just keep showing the old items. It's usually safe. It's usually fine. It's usually actually preferred. Because you have things like, hey, what if they went through a tunnel? And you're using their phone and they went through a tunnel and they just lost network access. It's better to leave the items that we got previously for when they come back out of that tunnel. Okay. So I do want to do kind of like we did before I initiate the request, I might want to set error back to blank. And so that way, you know, sometimes we'll get this case of we'll have items and an error. That's okay. But we won't get the case that you had before where the error never goes away. So it's that same trick that we used with the login form. Now, one thing I noticed just from a styling perspective, I probably do want to have a little bit of space underneath that message. So I might go down to here and add the class MB2 to this. And while I'm there, I think I'll add that class to the other error message as well. That's going to help space those things out. So really commonly, anytime you're displaying a list, this pattern you'll see a lot. You'll see a place to show error messages. You'll see a place to say, hey, there's no items. You may see a place to also show damage. Cool. All right. Now's a good time for a break. So I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a pause here. We'll come back at 3. And we'll kind of look at the next one. I think we're overdue for it. So you're going to cut this item. What you're missing is that item to power yeah. Did you get the error part that we just did? So you want to get that point. Okay. So you're getting an error. So you want to close your own efforts. So now try to log in. Yeah, see that number there? So we're trying to send a request to get to the server. So if you have the right path, but that means you're back in the server. And you also have an issue because that error should be showing up, like the network error should be showing. So this isn't right, which is what's causing the issue. But it should be still telling the user those problems. So let's see. Oh, yeah, you're missing a bunch of code. So I've got some more code in there. I don't think we could yesterday. Let's say set up. We'll set it to error URL. Actually, it's that it's going to take a minute to come there. So that's what we want to see.
But the reason you're seeing that is because they're this and we don't now start that. And you do that. So now, that's one, that's what. So, let's see if we can get that. It doesn't validate. So it's telling you that those credentials are not valid. I think that means you don't actually have it. So open up Mara and you import the users that I did right there. I think it's probably not. So I just like this one. Trigger request and a message, error about message. So I just generated a message, so it failed. Oh, so it happened. You're here.
So we're kind of starting to see some of the pieces fall into place, right? So we started by building out the login form, and with the login form, you saw what happens. Like, how do I send data to the server with like a post request? But now with this pet list, you're also seeing like, well, how do I get data, right? So we're seeing both sides of that. Posting data, sending data, as well as receiving data. There are still some enhancements that I want to make to this pet list component. So I do want to kind of walk through some of those. So the first thing I want to look at, next thing I want to look at here, and you don't need to necessarily copy this right now. So I'm going to make a quick switch. Remember that if I call API pet and then the ID of the pet, remember that gives me back the pet object, right? That's going to go request a single pet. Now, let's look at what happens in the front end when that occurs. Do you see how the front end kind of goes crazy? So the problem is that when I make a request to this here, that returns an object and not an array. I'm kind of presuming that the data is always coming back as an array. I'm making that assumption, but that's not really a good assumption to make, right? I do need to check that what I'm actually getting back is an array, right? Because it might not be an array. So what I want to do, I want to say, well, rather than just directly trusting it and taking the data we receive, I'm going to say, well, if underscore dot isArray, using another function from Lodash, if res dot data is an array, then it's safe to set it. Otherwise, well, we have an error. Otherwise, we expected an array and we didn't get an array. Okay, so I might want to say, let's call set error instead. And that way, if that does occur, we're just showing an error message instead of trying to pull that object and try and turn it into a list. So that's another case that we need to kind of check, is make sure that what we're getting back is either an object or an array as we expect.
Is that the solution we want to implement? We're not done yet, right?
Huh?
We're not done yet, right?
What do you mean not done yet?
Is that the solution we want to implement?
This is good.
That's it?
I think that's all we need. Because what we're going to say at that point is, if this happens, we need to go back and fix the code. There's a problem in our code, either here on the front end or the problem on the back end. At that point, we've got no way to fix it.
What about the pet list actually being just number of documents one?
Well, then it's still going to come back as an array.
Oh, well.
It still will come back an array. Even if it's an array of one thing, it would still come back as an array. So I'm going to move this back to pet list. So that's just how I'm going to guard against it. But it should never come back through the right URL. It should never come back as an array, as an object actually. But that does happen. Sometimes those things will happen. There are weird cases where you wouldn't expect, where maybe an attacker is changing things, or where you're on a Wi-Fi network that's like a Starbucks Wi-Fi network, and you're getting something else rather than what you expect. So those are cases where these things might occur. You might not think about it as, hey, it's returning something different than you expect because of other network things happening. Okay, so that's one. Next thing, I may also want to be able to send some data up to the server, right? So for instance, remember we've got a few different things with the list service that we can pass. Like we can search for pets by keyword. We can filter them out by species, etc. So you saw with the login form that if I want to send data with a post request, that I pass it like so. I pass it as this data property. Okay. It's a little bit different when we're sending data with a GET request. So rather than setting data, you actually have to set params. So for instance, if I wanted to say params species cat, this should only give me back the cats, which is what you see. So that's how you can send data up to the server. The interesting thing there, which I want to put into this example, is just to mention that's how you can set the page size. So like if I set a page size 1, that would just give me back the first thing. Or if I want to get, say, the first 1,000, I could just say page size 1,000. So that way, up until you get all the search interface working, that's kind of the starter point. Cool. Does that help? And that maybe help you when you get to around the hooking the search interface. I'd recommend doing the search interface last, later on in the process, but that at least gives you some pointers about how to send it. Cool. Another gotcha is that remember that our backends, both for the pet list, both for the bug list and the user list, those things actually require you to be logged in, right? In this case, I am allowed to connect to it, even if I'm logged in. My pet list is open game, but that's not true for your project that you're working on, right? So one of the things I need to be able to do is also be able to authenticate in this process. So I'm going to do one thing on the back end, just so I can demonstrate what happens here. So I'm going to go back to the back end here. I'm going to go down to the list route, and I'm going to add in is logged in as a middleware. Okay, so when I try to get the pet list now, let's save. You see it's sending request failed with status code 401 because I'm not authenticated, right? So for your systems, you'll often have requests after you log in, whether to get data, to update data, to create data, delete data, whatever it may be. You're going to be sending requests, and you need to authenticate those requests. Okay? Okay. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use the auth header. Okay. So we need to send the authorization header with our requests after you've logged in. Cool. So what we want to do is go back to this project. There we go. And in addition to params, I can also set headers. So if there are any headers you want to set, such as the authorization header that we want to set now, we set it here, authorization. And then remember that that needs to be sent to the server in the format where it's bearer and then the token. Okay? So this is how I'm going to pass the auth token back to the server. Does that make sense so far? Okay. Now I haven't actually put the token in there yet. Okay. So I need to have the token in the pet list. This means, right? I need to have access to it, right? And if we look at our pet list right now, our pet list doesn't have access to the auth token. It doesn't have any way to get to it. Okay. So who owns the auth token? Who has the auth token? Who's keeping track of it? Sort of. What component is keeping track of the auth token? Remember from yesterday? Remember up in the application as a whole owns the auth token. So I need to go back up to app, right? App, remember, has this state variable, right, called auth. I need to pass that down. So anything, and this is going to turn out to be that all of your components are going to need access to auth. Every page on your thing is going to end up needing access to auth. So I need to pass it down. So when I define it here on line 38, I'm going to say auth is equal to auth, so that I can pass it from the application down to the pet list. Okay. So that change I need to make at the higher level. Okay. Once I'm passing it down, I can come back to the pet list and I can accept it as a property, as a parameter. So curly braces auth. Do you remember the curly braces around that? Okay. And then we're going to use it here. So I want to effectively say, okay, this is like a template string. Boop. And here I want to put auth.token. So if I have that in place, okay. I'm going to log in, and it works, right? Because I'm sending the auth token. Okay. Now, so that's going to work, and that's going to send the. That's basically all you have to do is you just pass it down, and hey, we've got it, right? Now, there is one gotcha in that. Well, what happens if I'm logged out and I try to make this request? I try to go to the pet list now. So if I try to go to the pet list, if I'm not logged in, it immediately turns out and crashes because remember at this point when I'm not logged in, the auth is null. So I'm not checking in here that I'm not checking if the auth token, if the auth is there or not. It may not be there. Does everybody see that? So we need to check for that. I can only send that if we actually have a token. So I might borrow a trick from what we did yesterday and use some optional chaining and just say, hey, only try to access the token property if it's actually there, and that will prevent it from, if we're actually logged in, and that will prevent it from crashing. Cool. Easy trick. So if it's not logged in, it'll just send auth bearer and blank, rather than sending it, rather than trying to use reference. Does that help in terms of authentication and figuring that out? I think you had a question about that. So that's how you're going to send the tokens over, not that one. It's just a matter of needing to send all of it. Okay.
So we're getting these warning message for there's a little bit of virtual line.
Yep.
The array brackets at the bottom of this use effect statement. So you're getting two.
Oh yes. Yes. So what does this squiggly say?
The React must use effect is missing a
Yeah, that's a good question, and that just happened when we brought in the auth. It actually wasn't there previously. So it React use effect was missing the dependency. So because I brought in these square brackets, remember said only rerun this once. right? But now inherently, because I'm using auth to authenticate, I actually need to rerun this anytime auth changes. So if you log in as a different user, I need to resend this request. So the way to fix the error that it's mentioning is I just need to put auth in the square brackets, and this says rerun this effect if auth changes, if you're logged in as a different person.
So how would that actually take place? You have to have a second tab for your reason sign in, right?
No, it's actually as simple as log out and log back in, and that will trigger this. If you log out and log in, it will send out a new request with us. Simple as that. Or if you log out and go to the pet list unauthenticated, it'll rerun. Cool. So that's one gotcha in there is we need to tell it to rerun anytime there's auth. I know I had something else on my list. Oh, yes. Another thing to kind of keep in mind, things are running really fast right now. Okay. That's not always your user's experience. Your user's experience won't always be that things are running quickly. Okay. Sometimes things might be running slow. Okay. Sometimes their network connection may be slow. So we do need to kind of account for that a little bit. So the way I'm going to account for that is I'm going to go to the network tab in the DevTools. If you're looking on here, can everybody see network tools? There's a drop down up here. It says no throttling. You can actually pick an option from here and it will emulate a slower connection. Okay, so we can emulate, say, a offline connection. If the user were to get disconnected, we can emulate a slow 3G or a fast 3G connection. So I'm going to go all the way over to a slow 3G connection. Okay, I'm going to start this over again, refresh the page, and we can see that it takes a little bit of time to load the page in the first place. I'll log in. You can see it even takes some time to log in, but notice kind of as the page loads, there's kind of no indication that it's taking some time, right? If I go to the pet list, initially it says no items found, and then magically either we get an error or they pop up. I need to go back to my back end and get rid of that middleware so that it doesn't fail initially there. Okay, so oftentimes when you're rendering a list especially, or other things, anytime you have network connectivity happening, you usually need to tell the user that something's happening, that it's working, before the data comes in. So everybody hear that? So we typically need to tell the user that something's going on, rather than just saying there's nothing and then all of a sudden there's things. Okay, so what I often will do is I often want it to kind of show a spinner while it's loading the data and then hide that spinner. So everybody hear me with that? Okay, so I'm going to look at the Bootstrap documentation. Get bootstrap.com. Okay, if I go to the docs, we can look under components. Okay, and there's a few different components that Bootstrap has. So for instance, you can go to progress. Progress will kind of give you things like a progress bar, right? So if you know how far along is in the way it is, you can use that to measure progress. You can say, hey, it's 25% done, 50% done, etc. But oftentimes we don't know how long things are going to take. So these options, there's a bunch of them, only really work if you have some prediction about how long it should take. Okay. There's another component here called a spinner, which just looks like this. You'll see this on a lot of websites. So just spinning until it's done. all that spinning thing in there is just to say, hey, we're working, right? Something's happening. We'll tell you when you're done. So we really want to use this. Cool. I'm going to add a spinner. Okay. So let's say I bring that in. Let's see, what do we actually need? So in terms of things that we need, so we've got spinners represented by a div. It's got spinner border, and then like a color, so text primary, secondary, etc. It's got this role on there. That role is an accessibility thing. It's telling screen readers what's the purpose of this component. So it's giving users status on an operation. We then have inside of it, we have a span. You'll notice in the examples that it's not shown, but it's marked visually hidden here. Reason for that is that those spinners are actually not visible to screen readers, so we need to give them some text that they can see. So that's for screen readers, and then we have the closing field. So that's all we need, right, to represent a spinner. So I'm going to bring that in my code. Boot. Bring that over. And on my pet list, I'm going to go down, and so we're going to add another thing. So div, I need to give this class name spinner border. Spinner border. Maybe I just do primary color, so text primary. I need to give that role attribute. Role is status. And then bring in that span. So that's going to get us a nice little spinner there. Okay.
Is it class or class name?
Class name. Class name. That's interesting.
I'm doing this with both review, by the way.
Let me pull that back in. So I'm going to go to the pet list. Yeah, it worked for me. I'm going to try to... Did I make that? I thought I got rid of that on the back end.
Okay, now it's
there we go. Yeah. So adding a spinner, the actual HTML for it is pretty simple. The next thing we need to do is kind of conditionally show it. So we don't want to always be showing the spinner, which is what we've got here. We need to have some way of showing it or hiding it. Well, usually that means that we need to somehow link it to the state of the component, right? So if I think about the state of the component, okay, I've got items, I've got error, and okay, well, I can't say whether or not there's an error that indicates that it's working. I could have the items come back as an empty array, so I can't necessarily say that. I could even have the array come back as null. So it's sometimes, usually when I find out that I need another state variable to determine if it should be visible or not. Okay.
Can't you see items null?
Not really, because it might be that other things have happened and I come back as null. So I actually think the best thing to do is to add another variable. So I'm going to add in a variable. I'm going to call it pending. set pending, use state. And so initially, right, initially it hasn't loaded, so it's true. So initially it is pending. Okay. So we're going to say we've got a pending variable to track whether or not it's working. Initially it's pending. And then I'm going to go down here and I'm going to say, well, let's only show that spinner if it's pending. Pending and blah. Okay. So that's conditionally shown. Now, I still need to set it up so that the pending variable changes, right? So we need to set it to true or false in that use effect code. So initially, I want to make sure at the beginning that it gets set to true. Set pending is true, just to make sure it initially gets set to pending. And then once we get done, so say we get down here, one way or another, this needs to be marked as not pending. So set pending is false. And also in the error case, it's no longer pending. So that should get us to, it appears temporarily, and then switches over. Pretty slick. Really good as a way to indicate that, hey, something's happening, right? One of the things you might have seen there is that initially the no items list thing is showing. So that's another case where I just need to say, well, if it's not pending and there's not an error and it's empty, so there's a lot of conditions around that one little message. For testing purposes? Yeah. Yeah, it's really helpful to be able to just pop that on and see, okay, this is what my users are going to be experiencing, right? Because oftentimes it's not what you're used to seeing in testing. So like, that looks fine, it's fast, but you toss it on a slow 3G connection and it's not. It used to be that you had to do a lot of bandwidth limiting and you had to get your backend deployed, and this actually works. You'll notice I'm testing this with a local API. So that's tremendously helpful to get kind of catch some of those issues early. Okay. Yes.
When you have like this software thing,
Uh-huh.
Where the top up is the 401
Uh-huh.
on the front end.
Yep.
So like someone would say like they're not logged in.
That is a really good question. So one of the things you can do here, in the catch, you can actually ask it what the status code was. And so I can do things like I can say, okay, if it's this status code, then show this message. Or a more useful thing might be to say, hey, your status code 401, let's just send them back to the login screen. Right? Because if they're getting a 401, they're not logged in. Right? So I might actually type this such that I would say, hey, if the status code that came back is 401, I'm going to go ahead and call the onLogout function and send you back. So you can enhance that pretty easily with some of the stuff we've already talked about. Cool? Make sense? It's just a matter of asking for the status code and doing that logic. So that's something I'll let you take care of, because I think you can handle that part. But I wanted to kind of give you those pieces of like, here are some standard like conventions that we do of like, hey, we need to show that there's no items. We need to tell the user that there's errors. We need to tell the user that we're in the middle of doing things. So that's kind of where that lands. Okay. Let me go ahead and commit this where we're standing. I think there's still something. There's two things that we haven't touched yet. I think that's almost all that's left on my list. Oh, there's a little bit more than two things. Okay, so some things that we haven't looked at is I want to talk about toast, and I also want to maybe talk a little bit about React Router. We definitely have time to talk about toast today, probably not enough time to talk about React Router. So I'm going to try and get through that. That will be pretty easy. And if we have time to talk a little bit about React Router, then I'll get through that as much as I can. So all right. So a really common thing that happens, let me pull this over here, if I can get to the right page. Where Toastify, there we go. Okay. So a really common thing that you'll see on a lot of websites is these kind of toasts that appear. And oftentimes they'll appear kind of temporarily when things appear, when things happen. So like, hey, you got an error, we might show a quick toast just to tell you about it. And there's kind of progress bars and things like this. So this is a really helpful sort of add-on and easy to use library. So I want to show you a little bit about how to hook this up, both the login form and to the pet list. Okay. So first things first, you'll need to install it. I'll do that here in a minute. But I want to look at kind of the example code so we can have an idea of how this works. So they have a demonstration. Where's the demo site? There we go. So we can hit there, show toast. So that's kind of what we're going to get here in a minute. As you can see, every time I hit the button, it pops up a little window with some animations and all those kind of things, and it even has a progress bar that goes away gradually. Okay, so that's what we're getting in. That's what we're going for. Okay, there's some other things you can configure. So for instance, you configure what side of the screen it shows up. If I want to have it show up on the bottom right of the screen, I can do that. If I want it to show up as an error, that's there. Show up as success. So there's a lot of knobs there we can switch to kind of make it look a little bit better. Okay, or to change how we want it to appear. All right, so first thing I need to do is go to the terminal. So view terminal and kill my server so that I can install this package. Okay, so I'm going to do npm install react toastify. Okay. And I'm going to start the server back up now that I've installed that package. Okay. So my development server is running again. I actually want to get off of throttling, so I want to get off of the 3G at this point and be working with regular speeds. And so what I want to do is do some of the initial setup that's required to make that work. So there it is. Okay. So in order to make Toastify happy, we need to bring in two things. So over in the application, we're going to bring in some imports. We're going to import React Toastify. It also comes with some CSS, So I'm going to do that here in a minute. And basically the way this works, you add a toast container into your page, and then anytime you want to show a toast, you just need to call toast. So we have a little bit more wiring because where we need to show the toast is not in the application where we need to trigger it. But it's going to be that simple in the grand scheme of things. So in the application is where we want to be. And I'm going to add some imports up at the top. So first things first, import. And I'm going to bring these in. I'll copy them onto Discord if you want to just copy paste them in. So Discord, beep, beep, beep. So bring in the toast container, the toast method, and some CSS for that as well. You said what?
You need a dot / for that directory route?
No, because it's an NPM package. It's not our code. It's somebody. It's code from an NPM package. Yeah, remember / is anytime it's our own code. Okay, so they have both the CSS file and they have that. You might notice on my screen that there's some blue underlines. You see what that is? Toastify, it's a spell checker. Sometimes this will come up and the spell checker just doesn't know about those words. It's not in its dictionary. So one thing I often do when I see those things is I go to the quick fix and I just go add it to the workspace settings. You can add it to your user settings, and then it will be remember it that it's a dictionary word across your whole system. But oftentimes I'll add that just to the workspace specific. That's going to put it over here in the VS Code folder as like, hey, okay, now I know that's a valid word. That happens sometimes. So I just add it to the spell checker. Okay, so back down to where we want to be. I need to add in that toast container, and I'm going to add it here between the div and the main. So toast container, that's where the toasts are actually going to appear. So when they get added to the DOM, they're going to get added in this location. So kind of above or before the main. My experience kind of playing around with it, it doesn't matter too much where you put it. It actually seemed to have almost no impact to me. But if we wanted to position it, if we were able to relative position it, we might want it underneath the map bar kind of thing. Okay. So toast containers where we're going to show those things. I can then go and think about where I want to show those toasts. So the thing I want to start with is going back to the login form and saying, hey, if there's an error or success with the login, then I may want to show a toast. Okay, so going into login form, I might want to go here. Login form. Okay, so there's an error. We're going to go down here. And okay, so we've got a few different error cases. Okay. Oh, right. So before I do that, back to the application. I'm going to have a few different places where I want to show that toast. So I'm actually just going to add a function in here in the application, not in the login form. Function show error takes a message, and we're going to call that toast function and pass in the message. That way I have kind of a centralized place to define how we do this. Now I need to pipe that back down, so I need to make the show error function available to the login form. So I'm going to add that in here. Show error, show error. So I'm going to pipe it down to login form. And over in the login form, I want to receive it. So up at the top, we're going to say show error. And I want to call it anytime we have an error. So here, anytime we call set error, I'm going to call show error, res error with the same thing. Actually, not all of them, just those. So set error here, set error down here. So if it comes back as a string or it comes back as a generic error, those two cases I'm going to call show error. If I remember right. Okay. Because these cases I want to treat differently. Okay. Log in. Should have console. Something's not right. Oh, because I need to type in a thing. One thing you'll notice there, and I kind of missed this, you'll notice if I just leave the fields blank and hit login, it's not triggering it. So I do need to account for that. You'll remember up here, we said if there's an error with either, then I set it there. So show error, and I probably want to show the same error message. There we go. Pretty. So we got some nice little UI stuff happen there. That's awesome. Now you'll notice that it's kind of a rainbow colored bar because we haven't told it to actually show up as an error. So back in the application, I want to pass in some additional arguments. And namely, if I remember right, I need to set the type. Type here is error, and that should switch it over to being like that. Cool. Everybody kind of good with that? Pretty easy add-on, but it really helps to kind of call your attention to those errors much faster, that the user can see them. So maybe I try admin at test. And then we see like our invalid credentials. Cool. Now, let me pop this out into full screen mode, because I did notice one issue when I was playing around with this. Depending on where you have things hooked up, it may be that top right corner is potentially covering some things, because unfortunately it's also covering the nav bar. You might want to play around with having it be on a different corner. So one thing here, where did I go with that? I had that somewhere. There. Application. Position. That's what it is. So I can go to this one. That one. Got so many different windows open, I'm having trouble remembering what it is. Position, and you can set it to what side you want it to be. They have actually, I think you can put it in as a string.
Yeah, it's giving me all the options.
Is it?
When you just leave the cursor in there after you type it in the position mark.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. So if I want to put it on, say, the bottom right corner, I could just say bottom right, and it would appear down here. And let me go into mobile again. Depending on what side fits better, you might want to play around with that, but that's pretty simple. Yes? Show error is not a function, so that means that it's not piped down. So remember that you need to define it here, and you need to pass it down on the login form. So that means you probably are not passing it down. Okay. So the other benefit of defining that back in the app is that makes it very easy to just have one place where you want to position. So you see here, that final passing it down. And so go to the login form. So it's that same way anytime you pass it. Are you working with the we asked you to work on the thing we're working on now. So beep, beep. Yeah. So that's my little pop-up. So I can do either side. Maybe I'll go for this one. I'll go back to top right. But that can be helpful to move those things around. Okay. So other thing I might want to do is if the credentials are actually valid, like so, oftentimes you might want to pop up a message that says it's successful, right? So there I'm just popping up a message if there's an error. Oftentimes I might want to pop up a message when something is successful too. So I'm going to add another method in the application. We're going to call it show success. And the difference being there is I'm just going to set the type as success. So those messages are going to appear in green instead of appearing in red. And then I'm going to pipe that down to, actually I'm not going to pipe that down, I'm going to use it up here. So when you call on login, I'm going to call show success. And we might say something like logged in. Yeah, or welcome back or whichever. And vice versa, I can do the same thing with log out. I'm going to do a little exclamation mark. So logged in, logged out. So that way we get some kind of feedback as we're going back and forth. So log in, log in, logged in, and logged out. Now, why did it not work on log out? Oh, I know. I have an issue with, yeah. So I mean, that part's nice in terms of the logged in. I know what's happening with the log out. So with the log out, I kind of have a problem that I introduced yesterday and I need to fix. So because we're not preventing the default action when I click the logout button, it's actually triggering a page refresh. So I do need to fix that. So if I go back into the nav bar, I need to add a function over on the side of the nav bar. Function on click logout takes the event because I need to call evt.preventDefault first, and then so the page doesn't refresh, and then I can call on logout. So I'm going to define that little function up here, and then I'm going to call it down when you click that. So that should fix the issue with the message not appearing. No, because because we need to do more things. Like we need to set the auth to null and etc. Like if you look at what onLogout does, it's actually doing two things. It's changing the screen as well as clearing out the auth. So I need a special function for that. So that's one thing I missed. Yes. Oh, actually, I do need to prevent the default for that. Okay. So we have some success messages. We have some error messages. That, I mean, a little bit of code goes a long way there. We can do the same kind of thing with the pet list and say, hey, if there's errors, right, we want to pipe that down. So pipe down show error to the pet list. And over here, we receive it, show error. And I would say here, show error, error.message. And I'd also call it up here. So that if those errors do occur, it'll immediately pop up. Now, you'll see the same kind of yellow squiggly appearing down here that we saw before. Remember what that was about? That was because we wanted to say, hey, you're using a property, you probably need to run the effect again. So the way that we deal with that, because we're using the show error property, I just need to add that to the array. We'll say also rerun the effect of show error changes, and that will make it happy. So that way, if there's any issues getting the pet list, that would appear as well. Back over.
Remind me where you just put the show error. I understand you brought it into the function.
Yeah.
Where do you in pet list?
So in pet list, you saw I just added it down here. Okay. And I added it these two places. The two places where we're calling setup. So center, shoulder, center, shoulder.
So not only are we putting that message into the DOM.
Into the DOM, we're also putting up a little pop-up hook just to make sure users see it. You know, because that calls more attention to it. So oftentimes what we want to do, both. Okay, cool. So adding that is in pretty easy. In fact, you know, things like that can be really helpful for debugging, because you might say, hey, I want to maybe show a message when the data is loaded just to see when does the data get loaded, and then you have a pop-up to see if that's happening. So it's a really, like, Toastify, React Toastify is super easy to use, as you can see, but really, I would say adds a lot in terms of just making it look more user friendly, more professional. But definitely good app. Okay, so let's call that enough for today. I want to talk some more about the router and how do we get the router to work in tomorrow. But that's kind of its own deal. But so far you've seen kind of two pieces, right? So we've seen the list of pets. We've seen the login form that actually should give you a bunch of stuff to kind of start to move forward with fleshing out your bug tracker project. Cool. So I'll be kind of around as people have issues today to kind of make sure everybody's caught up, and then I'll kind of do the next thing tomorrow. So I'm going to check that in. All right, Toastify. Yes.
And it pertains to my GitHub
and
and checking